Chapter 13 The Nettle Patch. It was Kenzie's fault in the first place. He came home without Star and Boss. Oh, he heard their bells all right. They were in the big swamp beyond the Nettle Patch. He had Covenhoven's black and tan hound along. That swamp was a rich treasure place to a hound's nose. He ran so far ahead you couldn't see him. But when they went in after the cows, it sounded like something came for the dog through the brush. It made a monstrous racket. What it was, Kenzie didn't know, but the hound popped out a yelping and hid behind the boy. Then it was that Kenzie reckoned he better come home and get the rifle. "You let your hands off that rifle," Sayward said. "Guerdon can go back with you. Why, that rifle's twice bigger 'n you are." "I can handle it, ma'am," Guerdon promised. "You mean you can let Kenzie shoot hisself with it? When he's big enough, he can have it. Uncle Wyatt had it when he was 11. Guerdon threw at her, but he didn't wait for an answer. It would do no good. She would never let them have it. Resolve was the only one she'd trust it to, for he was her favorite. Well, maybe he was just as well off. That rifle would be mighty heavy to tote all the way out there and back. He'd just as soon carry the corn cutter. Will Beagle made it and said you could lay an Indian's guts on the ground with it. Guerdon took it down from its peg in the log barn and went out the far door, keeping the barn between him and his ma'am so she couldn't see what he carried. She'd be liable to make him put even that back. Once they got to where Kenzie heard the noise, it was thick with brush and dark as candle time. The vines in here had butts like trees. It had places you had to watch out, or the quicksands would get you, and other places called prairies, where no butts grew, only grass and weeds. But if it had any heavy thrashing beast in the swamp any more, it kept mighty still now that he had the corn cutter. All Guerdon could hear were the sweet, lonesome notes of the swamp robin and the faraway bells of Star and Boss. He and Kenzie had to go through the bull laurel to get near them. It was something to see. In June, the flower bunches, big as your head, and waxy white in this dark place. Now why wouldn't those ornery cows come home? The flies were bad in here as around the house. Besides, Sayward had them build a fire outside the house in fly time. The cows would stand in the smoke to get away from the pest, and when the smoke moved, they moved too. They had as much sense as a human. Some said that when cows didn't come home, it meant a spell had been cast on them. Then they forgot they ever had a stable to stand in, or a mistress to milk them. Guerdon halfways believed that. He was on ahead now. They were out of the bull laurel and in the nettle patch. He was all sweated, and those nettles burned like fire when they touched him. He bent down to crawl the path under and between two big stands of nettles. He should have looked where he set his hand. He heard Kinsey holler behind him, but it was too late. He thought he felt a nettle sting the end of his second finger. When he looked down, there the spotted serpent lay. Oh, never had he seen anything so fat and ugly. It almost made him puke to see it, and think his hand had reached down by it. Now he had the mark of the beast burned on him, and already the poison was a-spreading in his veins. "Did it get you, Gordie?" Kinsey was hollering to him. "Oh, it got me all right," Gordon said. "I never heard it rattle," Kinsey called. "It's a black-spotted one," Gordon said. "Them kind never rattle." Savagely he finished off the curled-up beast with the corn chopper. Then he backed out to a clearer space, where it had more light to look at his hand. He could see the ugly twin marks. Hell's needles they were, the devil's thumbprint. Already he reckoned the finger looked a little different, a mite fuller and more yaller. It was starting to swell, and the yaller was turning black already. After the finger, it would go to his hand, and after that his arm. He wished he was home. His mam would know what to do, but he was a good ways from home. He couldn't wait till he got back now. He walked around with Kinsey, following, till he came to an old log half as high as he was. It was stitched in moss and green like it had been dipped in paint. "Take this corn-cutter, Ken," he said. Kinsey took it wondering. Gordon laid the suffering finger on the top of the log, like the neck of a gypsy fowl on the chopping block. "Now you can cut it off." Kinsey gravely studied the finger. Clear off, he wanted to know. "Just at the top knuckle, not the whole finger. It'll bleed. I want it to. That's what'll get the poison out. What if I miss it?" "Go ahead. You can whack at it again. I mought chop your hand off." "No, you won't. You can see better than that." Kinsey stood stock still. He squinted this way and that, lifted the corn cutter several times, but he didn't bring it down. "I ain't good at this. I never done it before." "Give it here," Gordon cried, exasperated. "If you can't, I can." He shut one eye and measured with the corn cutter. Then he drew it back and struck. "Now give me a piece from my shirt," he told him shortly. "You ought to be able to cut that off." Whatever tarnal thing it had in the swamp before, its spell must have been broken when Gordon killed the snake, for the cows started to come in by themselves just then. They walked high with their bells ringing, but Gordon just about made home. He came to the cabin with the skin tight as a drum over his arm, a fire in his eyes, and the world spinning around. His pappy asked stern what he had been doing. "Nothing. I just got stung out in the nettle patch," he said. His mam took one look at him and put him to bed downstairs, where she could tend him. First she unwound that rag from his aching finger and washed it with warm water from the kettle. She washed his face and hands and the rest of the arm too. Never did he expect his mam's strong hand could be so easy. Not a word of scold for his finger or his shirt, and his pappy never quibbled over the whiskey she poured from his jug over the wound. She gave the boy to drink of it too, and he didn't know which burned the harder, his throat or the stump of his finger. He felt he could sleep a little now, but do you reckon she would let him? No, she raised up his head every few minutes, and made him drink water from the gourd. He drank so much she had to hold him up, on his unsteady knees while he made his water hot and scalding in the old cedar bucket. "It's good it wa'n't my first finger, ma'am, or I couldn't fire off a rifle," he told her, and she nodded grave like she'd let him take out the rifle every day if ever he overed this. It was a sealed book, he reckoned, whether you overed a snake bite or not. Only God Almighty knew. Soon as folks heard about it, they came by to see how he was making out. He could tell he was pretty sick, the way they looked down on him. They all had some cure they wanted say were to try, and his ma'am listened quiet to each how it was done. Molly Weaver said the best was to take him out and dig a hole in the ground, and then bury his hand and arm in it up to the shoulder. Miss Covenhoven said she would kill a skunk, and failing in that a cat, and put its hide warm on the wound, the bloody side under. A black cat was best, Will Beagle said. It had a stone some places, and if you put that stone on where a snake or wolf bit you, the stone would draw the poison out. All you had to do when it stopped drawing was turn the stone around to some fresh place. He believed he could find such a stone in the woods around here if it was daylight, but Sayward said she would stick to her own receipt. Nobody that dropped in that evening left right off. They all hung around. You could tell, waiting to see what happened. They wanted to carry the news home he was either better or a gone Josie. Even Colonel Sodom stayed. When he first stopped in with his cane, he said he wanted to see this boy who had the cheek to chop off his own finger. Gordon could hear their talk coming to him. Sometimes what came through his head made sense, and sometimes it didn't. Mary Harbison said when they first went up to the place they had now, many a day she looked out the door and saw a rattlesnake setting on their door log, looking in. She said one time she gave little Salome a bowl of milk and went out to work in the corn patch. Something made her go back and look in the cabin. There was her baby still a-setting on the floor, drinking at the milk, and a spotted rattlesnake lapping up what she spilled. She stood there, not a-knowing what to do, for if she ran in, the snake might strike her baby. She waited till Salome reached her spoon at the snake. Then she screeched before she thought, and the snake slid out through a hole in the chinking. She said she hated real bad to kill that snake. She felt sure it knew Salome was just a babe and harmless, and she felt grateful to it for not hurting her. Afterwards, Molly Weaver told about the woman she knew back in the old state. That woman's baby always cried in the morning because she had no milk for it. One night her man got awake and found a snake in bed, a-sucking at her breast, and that's why she never had any milk for her babe, because after her man killed the snake, the babe had plenty. Now why did Colonel Sodom have to go and spoil that story? He said he didn't believe it, but he could relate one he couldn't explain. Back home, somebody from the country fetched in a live rattlesnake with 12 buttons, and the storekeeper put it in a hogshead, where the boys had fun with it. First time the colonel looked down at it, he didn't know what came over him. He saw those snake eyes a-blazing up at him from the dark hogshead, and it made him feel faint all over. For the first time in his life he thought he was going to swoon. He believed he would have fallen in the hog's head if somebody hadn't helped him off. He judged that how rattlesnakes put a spell on birds and small beasts with their eyes. No, Jake contradicted him. They did it with their smell. He once smelled rattlesnakes after a rain, and that was the orneriest smell he ever did smell. A woman would have passed out. Gordon believed he felt a mite better. It had worse things in this world than to lay here with nothing to do but have folks talk and worry over you. He couldn't get over how good his mam had been to him. She was so calm, most times you thought she took you for granted and didn't give a whoop for you any more. But let something real like this, or stone blindness, or black plague come along, and you found out how much she liked you. Why, she'd chop off her own finger if it would help him any, he could tell. It gave him a feeling for her like old times. Every once in a while her face hung over him, seeing how he was. The rest of the time he was satisfied to lay there with the sociable feel of folks sitting around the cabin, and the sound of their talk flowing over him, soft and easy, like the soapy water his mam had washed him with. It was Jake Tench who kept saying that rattlesnake bite was worse for a young one than a growed person. When Gordon's mam and pap went to the door with Colonel Sidham, Jake came over and held Porteous's whiskey jug to the boy's mouth. He told him he better drink if he wanted to live. More, he said, while Gordon choked and sputtered. More, he kept saying, till Sayward came in and took the jug away from him. When Gordon lay back, the room purred like a cat with the whiskey. After a while, the ends of the cabin started to go up and down like they were loose, and the loft like a cradle rocking. That whiskey was fighting the poison now, he could tell, for he felt a heap better. "My lights and livers," he yelled before he knew it, sitting bolt upright in his bed. The company talk stopped short. "Ye," he shrieked like he was in pain. "What's wrong, Wordy?" his Aunt Jenny wanted to know. "Hallelujah" and "salvation" he howled at the top of his voice, like he heard the circuit rider do. "Hallelujah" and "Amen." The folks were staring. "He's gettin' religion," Mary Harbison said. "I'm runnin' out the devil," he hollered. "Vamoose," as the Lord said to the white-whiskered man. "Get out, you dod-rotted, long-haired, long-eared, long-horned devil." "Gordon," his mam said sharply. He felt too good to stop now. He yipped and hooted. When he saw Huldah, Libby, and Kinsey looking down at him from the loft hole, it only set him on. "I'm a peddler," he shouted. "I'm come from Maytown. I'm a tradin' razors and breastpins. See this here fine whisker cutter. I'll cut your meat and slice toenails. All you got to do is buy it and put it in your pocket. You'll wake up with a clean shave and a clean shirt in the mornin', and 5 shillin' in your pocket." "The pisons put him out of his mind," Miss Covenhoven said. His mam made him lay back. All were starin' at him save Jake Tench, who was laughin' fit to kill. "He's drunk, that's what he is," Aunt Jenny said finally. Soon as his mam let him loose, Gordon heaved up again. What his Aunt Jenny said put him in mind of a catch she sang when company came to the Covenhovens. It had plenty verses, and he only knew a few. Now he yelled those verses at the top of his voice, keeping time with his head and hand at the same time. That night I come a-ridin' home, as drunk could be. I seen a head on the bolster, whar my head oughter be. Come here, my dear sweet Ellen, I married lawfully. How come a head on the bolster, whar my head oughter be? You blind fool, you drunken fool, can't you never see? It's nothing but a cabbage head your granny sent to me. I've traveled this wide world over 1,000 miles or more, but a mustache on a cabbage head I never did see before. A slew of laughing followed that. He knows it nigh as good as you, Jenny. Molly Weaver spoke. He ought to. He's heard it oft enough, Aunt Jenny said. You can tell singin' runs in the Luckets, Will Beagle said, with a look at Jenny, for, though she was married, never had he given her up. Sayward pushed Gordon flat in bed again. Now lay down and hush up, she told him, but he thought by her eyes that his tomfoolery made her laugh like the rest. Jake Tench came across and looked down. Looks like he's overed it, he said, like he was disappointed. He ain't a-goin' to die after all. I reckon me and Will can go home now. We won't have to take measurements for his grave box. Of course, you never can tell. Sometimes they take a turn for the worse. I knowed a boy once. Now let 'em alone, Jake, Sayward said sharply. You done enough to 'em. All that saved his skin was the whiskey, Jake declared. How much would you a-took for him 2 hours back? Not the whole country, and you thrown in, Sayward told him. Gordon looked up at her, closed his eyes, and looked at her again. It wasn't so bad to get by a spotted sarpent, he reckoned. He was short, a finger above the knuckle, but he had his mammy back. A mam like he had didn't grow on every bush. He'd chop a whole finger off for her any time she wanted it. Chapter 14. Freely be his wife. Sayward had her mind made up. This was something she had studied out for a good while. She had all the young ones she aimed to. She felt thankful she had no more while she was poorly. If she had, she couldn't have kept her head above water. Now that she felt stouter again, she still had her hands full. Never did she lack for something to do. It took a pile of spend stuff and stitches to make all her young ones' clothes and keep them mended. That was a crowding when the whole grist of Wheelers sat down to the table, Resolve, Gordon, and Sooth on one side, and Kinsey, Huldah, Libby, and Desia on the other. Being the youngest, Sooth and Desia sat on their mam's either hand, so she could tend their mush bowls. Porteous sat stern with his back to the door, and Sayward with her back to the hearth, handy to pots and Johnny cake board. Sayward could hardly believe sometimes she had all these, and that she was their mam. Most of them had looks and ways she never saw in the Luckets, or Powleys either. How they all came from her, and every one different, was something to make a body wonder at. There was Resolve, the book reader, steady and sober-minded. You could see it in his walnut-brown eyes and hair. Now Gordon had coaly-black Indian hair, was supple as a kitten, and wouldn't read a book if it was printed on flowery chiny silk. Aunt Jenny said he was a Lucket with a Yankee gimber jaw, but Kinsey had sorrel hair, light blue eyes, and a body plastered with hickory nut freckles. He was a sight to see when he washed all over, in front of the fire or took off his clothes to go in the river. Of the oldest two girls, Hulda was the smarter. You would have to watch her. She could be pretty as a picture with her long black hair and eye winkers, but the devil was in her like an Asha. Now Libby had yaller hair and a fat little bread basket, like Sayward had when she was a girl, and she never took anything serious save plaguing her brothers and sisters. She used to devil Sooth. Sooth better be good. She better watch out, or the Shawanese would lift her red scalp to make them a light through the woods on a dark night. Little Sooth believed her. Before she went out, she would tie a rag over her small head against any Shawnee spying from the woods, for her hair was like fire. Now Dizia would never get taken in like that. She sat like a grown body at the table. She was the oldest-faced young one you ever did see. Old in her ways, too. Some ran and hid when strangers came, or sat tongue-tied in the chimney corner. When Dizia was littler, she crawled to her mam, pulled herself up at her skirt, and stood there looking the person over with knowing gray eyes. Even on her hands and knees on the floor, she had been like little old grand folks, telling common folks what to do. Oh, Sayward knew this was no Luckett, or Pally she had borne. She put Sayward in mind of a person she'd never seen or even heard tell how she looked. That person was Porteous's mother, sitting starched and polite in her fine Bay State home. Let's see now, Sayward used to tell herself when she was poorly. Resolve was one, and Gordon two. Kinsey and Hulda made 4. Libby and Sooth 6, and Dizia 7. That didn't count poor little Sully, lying yonder in the berry hole. 8 was more than her own mam had borne. Of those 8, none hadn't been wanted. None would she give up without hard fighting, and none was her favorite over another. She loved this one as good as that, but it had a time to start and a time to quit. She knew when she had enough. When she looked back, she found she hadn't felt good since Dizia came. The other babies had been nothing to carry and bring forth, but this strong young one with the old face and master ways had taken something from her. She was a Yankee through and through, and you could always trust a Yankee to get the best of a deal. She felt stronger again now, and she was bound she'd keep that way. Oh, she couldn't expect Porteous to fall in line with her, now that he hankered after a big family especially. It was just hard on a man, Sayward reckoned, when his woman stopped being a wife to him. He didn't stop to figure out he'd had a mighty easy time of it, making trouble whenever he wanted, and then going about his business. The woman was the one that had to pay the fiddler. She had to give her flesh and blood before her babe was born, and her milk and tending afterward. You might as well say she was Mammy and Pappy both. The man was just the one who didn't know what he was doing when he dropped the seed, like a squirrel hiding a nut or acorn in the ground. That squirrel had no notion of raising a stand of oaks or a chestnut orchard. Truth to tell, you could almost do without the man, but you hadn't dare tell him so, or he'd be miffed. The way Porteous acted, he must have reckoned it a terrible thing. this going against her vow to freely be his wife, but he'd get used to it in time. She was glad he had Tateville to take his mind off of it, for the Major's town was going great shakes. Porteous had to tramp up there every Saturday morning to take care of his law business in town. She looked for him to rub it in what a mistake she made, not trading the farm for a fine brick house in town when she had the chance, but hardly ever did he talk his own self about Tateville. He would come back tired and close-mouthed. It was his children who egged it out of him. No matter how late at night, they would stay up awaiting for him. They would stand around, a little afraid of him at first, as he sat in his hickory chair in front of the fire. Usually Huldah was the first to get up grit to ask him something. Soon all were putting in their oar, a-begging what he did and saw that day in town. Oh, it wasn't just Tateville, but town. Sayward told herself. Her young ones hadn't given up the notion of being town bodies some time. Now and then the tale of some grand Tateville doing would make them raise their eyes at their mother like she had done them wrong. They never forgave her for not going to the auction Independence Monday and taking them along. Their pappy said folks had come to that auction for 20 mile. Whiskey had run like water, and any hand, young or old, had leaf to hold its cup to the barrel. Peddlers had their booths loaded down with lace and trinkets, calicoes and domestics, gingerbread and sweetmeats. A Vendue man with the gift of gab had raffled off the lots, and 2 men had fought over a piece of ground hardly big enough to stake a cow on. By winter it had so much business around Tateville. Porteous had to close his school Fridays to go up there. Saturdays weren't enough. Sayward just felt glad to see his learning get him some place, and for all the fee stuff coming in. But Jenny acted different. What does he have to run up R all the time for? She questioned. Law takes time, Sayward explained to her. They talk over all the points. Then Porteous has to write out his law papers. Seems like a lot of business to be up R overnight every week, Jenny sniffed. Now Porteous's boys and girls reckoned it wonderful. The first time he stayed 2 days they had to hear all about it, how he stopped the night in Vrain's tavern, and what the tavern was like with him sitting in the bar room writing out documents, a fire going in the monster fireplace, singing and fiddling by the bar, and jigging on the bar room floor. And did you have to stay in the tavern all night, Pappy? Little Sooth pitied him. Didn't you have a cabin to go to up there? Sayward smiled to herself, a secret smile. For if Porteous wouldn't take to sitting in a bar room with the company of men and spirits, she did not know what he would like, and yet he'd put on a long face tonight, and let his children feel sorry for him and cross at their mam, who made him have to tramp that far ways every week and have his office in a tavern, all because she wouldn't sell the plantation and move to town to live. Tonight they wouldn't go to bed. They plagued him to know what a town was like in the winter time. How did it look as you came to it through the woods, with a score of roofs turning back the sun, and as many chimneys sending up blue smoke all at the same time? They could only imagine, for never had they seen 4 brick houses and 17 log ones. not counting stables and outhouses, 6 or 8 of the houses rising to a second story, and more going up next summer as a speculation. They wished they could lay eyes on that public square with a kiln for burning street brush, or the mail that left every Monday on horseback, or the pump that fetched out water faster than 10 men and an ox could drink it. Oh, those young ones couldn't hear enough about town tonight. They made him tell again about Major Tate's cannonball from Fort McHenry that weighed as much as a barrel of flour and was marked a present from the King of England, and about that piece of dress taken from the body of a woman blown to pieces by a bombshell in the environs of Baltimore, and about the manufactory of Tateville, a still house for whiskey. When they got their pappy telling it, they could see in their minds that spirits factory standing on the street, belching wood smoke from its chimney over the roofs of the town, and men going in with empty kegs under their arms, and coming out with those kegs heavy on their shoulders. Sayward at her big wheel said no word for a while. She wouldn't have opened her mouth at all if it hadn't been for her children. You could see they thought themselves plumb lost down here in the woods. They were at the lonesome ends of the earth. They couldn't make out what their mam saw around the moonshine church, for it had only a meeting house, a school, and a house. It didn't even have a store, for George Roebuck's was a good piece up where Crazy Creek flowed into the river. But when Porteous made fun of the Indian trace and deer paths, they had to stumble on down here, while in town they had streets to walk their ease on. That was too much for Sayward. She'd stick up for the moonshine church if it was the last thing she did. Her eyes had a baleful glint at her husband. "Have you a meetin' house up ar?" she challenged him. "No, the citizens are well disposed toward each other," he said tolerantly. "Have you a burying ground?" Sayward went on. "That also is unnecessary. The situation is wonderfully healthy." "Well, do you have a schoolhouse or academy?" she persisted. "They are forming one now," Porteous coughed, "and a grist mill. Have you one close by, like we got here?" "Not yet. However, the town soon will have. But you don't have a school or meetin' house or grist mill now," Sayward concluded triumphantly. She flashed a look to resolve at his loom, but he kept his eyes away. Even her oldest and steadiest was siding with his pappy. He was the one she had counted on the most. If he failed her, mighty near all was lost. She'd have no heart to stay here for just her own self. She watched him as she went on with her spinning, a walking back and forward, holding the threads high with one hand as she sent the wheel faster and faster with the other. But Resolve just kept on with the loom where he had left off to listen, tossing the shuttle back and forward, giving his steady thwacks and thumps with the beater. That and the woo-woo-woo of her wheel were the only sounds now left about the cabin, for the young ones had climbed to the loft. It was late until she and Resolve quit. He went to put on his cap to go out before going to bed. Then, at the door, he called her so sharp, she came a-running to see what was wrong. With the cold air on her face, she stopped. It was snowing, but that wasn't what held her. The first thing she thought was, "Now, what made me reckon it was late? It can't be. There's the sky, still red from the sun going down." Then she recollected what time it was. Why, Porteus had come home after dark. That was a long while ago. They had sat and talked a good ways into the night, and after that she and Resolve had worked a piece. It must be after 11 o'clock, and this was a long winter's night. Then, what in God's name was that red a-flooding the sky? It stretched all the way from north to south and east to west, but was worst up toward the English lakes. Now it would fade, and now as they looked it got brighter and redder, till every snowfall coming out of that sky looked on fire, and every fleece a falling firebrand. She and Resolve stood there together, with a million snowflakes dropping like sparks around them. Any minute it looked like the woods would be set on fire. "What is it, ma'am?" Resolve asked her in a low voice. "I don't know yet," she answered cautiously, not saying what had flashed across her mind. "I've lived a long time in the woods, but I never seen or heard tell of anything like this." "It says in the Bible," Resolve whispered. "Hush up," she told him. "Porteus." He came to the door. "Shades of Phlegethon," he declared, whatever that meant. It was the weirdest sight to see, and the three stood watching it till somebody hurried down the trace and came part ways over through the snow. It was Matthias Cottle, who had been at the Covenhovens. "It's the end of the world, Porteus," he called. "You still want to buy those shoats you looked at, Saird?" "I changed my mind when I seen them," Sayward said. "They're too small." "How do you mean to sell them, Matthias? Live, weight, or roasted?" Porteus put in for a joke. Matthias drew himself up. "I just tried to do right by ye. I'm going home now, and put my house in order. I'd get myselves indoors if I was you, and set on my stools like in church. The Lord ain't far off. He's a-comin' and a-burnin' all the books but the Bible." This last was a dig at Porteus. As Matthias went off, a strange black figure in the fiery snow, Sayward felt Resolve tremble like a shaking ash leaf. Her voice came out strong and matter-of-fact. "Porteus, don't you and Resolve want to take your old coats and see if anybody's in trouble up the trace? You might be able to lend a hand." They left right away, and it was mighty late when they got back. All the red was out of the sky by now. Sayward had waited up, puttering at this and that, till they came. "What was it?" she cried before they were through the door. "George Roebuck's," Porteus said gravely. The strong smell of smoke was on them both. Not the sweet scent of chimney smoke, but a rank and terrible stink with no good in it. His warehouse, too. "He lost everything," Porteus said. "Couldn't he get nothin' out at all? He saved some of his stock, but the buildings burned to the ground." "Well, I feel real sorry for him," Sayward said. "I hope you told him he and Will was welcome to sleep down here. They had to stay and keep watch over their things." "You ask if there's anything we can do." Porteus was getting ready for bed. "Nothing," he said wearily. He must build everything new. She happened to catch Resolve's eye. He hadn't started for the loft as yet, but stood looking at her. She couldn't fathom the strange look he had watching her. "They's something you didn't say," she told him. Resolve looked at his father, who said nothing. So the boy spoke. "George Roebuck isn't building up there again, ma'am." "How's that?" Sayward asked before she thought. "He says the land's too low. He gets flooded out every spring." Sayward wondered why her legs suddenly felt heavy. So George Roebuck, the shrewdest head in these woods, was forsaking her too. She turned to get her bedgown from its pegs on the log. "He's goin' to Tateville," she said dully. No, he told Pap he'd like to build down here at the Moonshine Settlement if you'd sell him a piece of land. He wants it between the church and the river. Sayward stood there, taken unawares, trying to spell this out, her old red flannel bedgown in her hand. "Well, I don't know as I'd want all his loafers so close to our place," she declared. But down in her heart she knew she'd sell him an acre if he wanted it, and that they could get together on price. So that she reckoned was why Resolve had looked at her so strange. He felt a mite better satisfied to stay down here now. It was getting to be more of a settlement with a house, a school, a meeting house, and burying ground, a store and a grist mill not too far off. You might almost call it two houses, for George Roebuck would be living in the back of his store. Chapter 15. The Reap Hook. It was the year that Woman came down from Tateville to take over Porteus's school. He had to give up his teaching or his law work, either one, for Tateville was a growing, and so was the settlement around the Moonshine Church. Porteus had more deed and court work now than he could do along with his school work. Up at Tateville they had a York State man keeping school in his own house, but it seemed all Porteus could get hold of for down here was a schoolmistress. Sayward thought she would like a look at this woman when she came. Her name was Miss Bartram, and she hailed from Philadelphia. Her folks were all dead, save her uncle, and he had headed out for Indiana Territory. Porteus told the children it wouldn't be Mr. Wheeler's Academy any more. It would be Mistress Bartram's school, and she would let girls come as well as boys. They could learn reading, sampling, and fancy stitches, and needn't be much good at Latin or the Rule of Three. Now wasn't it gritty of a woman, Sayward thought, to take over a man's job of mauling letters in young heads? When folks asked her how did Porteus come to pick a woman for the school, she didn't mind. She just said, likely he couldn't find a man with learning enough to fill the bill. No, she didn't know if this woman was young or old. Porteus didn't say, and it hadn't come to mind to ask, but to herself she reckoned she would like to get a good look at this woman when she came down in April for the last school day. Resolve was on tenterhooks over the last school day. His ma'am had promised him a suit of clothes to stand up in and give his oration. She and he had picked out the goods at George Roebuck's. The trader had only a flap or two of cloth left on the bolt, but more of the same was on the way, he claimed. Every day Resolve watched across the fields to see if a boat had come up the river. George Roebuck had a fine establishment here at the Moonshine Church now, brick in front and log behind. It was a mighty handy place for the Wheelers, standing just yonder beyond the church and the river. Most times the store carried anything you wanted. This Saturday, when a keel boat for Tateville stopped, Resolve let the team stand in the woods and ran over. But the trader gave him only a sharp face. He reckoned the suiting must have got lost on the way. Anyhow, it was not with this shipment. "What can I do?" Resolve asked him. "If you wanted new clothes, you should have been a girl," George Roebuck told him. "I could sell ya all the bombazine, salonet, or merino you wanted." That was a bitter cup for Resolve. The last school day, only a week off. What would his mammy say to this, he wondered, as he dragged rails and strung them out for her worm fence. All winter, in his spare time, she and he had mulled them together, mostly of hackberry and black walnut, for those split the easiest and straightest. First they cut the butts 8 feet long and drove in the iron wedges. Afterwards they could use dogwood gluts. His mam was good as a man at having quartering, sometimes double quartering, splitting the heart off of each for an extra rail. What was left made 2 more. Her mauls were so heavy he minded the time he could hardly lift one. She made them out of thick twisted hickory roots, and drove an iron ring in each end to keep them from splitting. They were tougher than a hog snout. Oh, his mam could do most anything around the plantation. She had raised this team of oxen from bull calves and gelded them her own self with nothing more than a butcher knife. He and Guerdon had helped to tie them down, while the rest of the young ones looked on. Those young steers carried on for a while, but now they went along, mild as milk, dragging all the rails you could lift on the dry sled. His mam could lay a worm fence, good as John Covenhoven, locking each rail with the next, and 6 to 8 rails high to keep the stock from jumping. She could still outmow him, never hitting a stump or missing a stalk. When he was a little fellow, binding after her reap sickle, she would stop, come back, and help when he got behind. His thumb was too little to push the twist under the band, so she made him a grooved stick to work it under. When wheat was short and the band wouldn't go around, she showed him how to make a double band. Divide it into 2 and twist it around his fist so it reached. She and he always worked together. He still drove her geese in the shed for her and closed the door. She'd hold one up against her and pick it till only down was left on its breast. It didn't hurt it none, she would say. It'll soon grow out. Then he would open the door and let that one go. The old geese knew what was coming, and let her do it, but she had to pull an old red stocking over the heads of the younger ones to keep them from pinching her. Oh, his mam could do nigh about anything. Lose her in the woods, and she'd come out. Shake the meal bag dry, she'd still find something for supper. But this time she'd be stumped. How could she sew him up a fine new suit when George Roebuck didn't have the goods? He felt mighty discouraged as he threw off the last rails and hawed Buck and Bright around. Only thing left now was send up with his pap to Tateville for suit cloth, and if he knew his mam, she would never do that. Just say Tateville to her, and rocks came in her cheeks. She believed in trading at home, she'd say. What was the matter with the Moonshine Church settlement? She'd come back at him. He was a gone Josie. That's what he was. The black ox had tramped him. He'd have to stand up and give his oration in old mossy black pants and jumper that everybody knew were cut down from his pappies. It was getting dark when he quit and went in. He dragged a log for the wood pile, far as the house, so as not to come in empty-handed. The yoked oxen followed him to the barn, the nigh one, Buck, keeping just behind. They followed so faithful you had to tell them when to stop. If you didn't and went in the kitchen door, they'd try to come in after you, reckoning you expected them to, or you would have said so. His mam was milking in the barn yard when he told her about the suiting. The milk kept going, chirp, chirp, in her cedar pail. She didn't even look around. Through supper, her face never changed toward him, and all evening she said no word about it. Oh, she'd heard him all right. He knew that. It was just his mam's way. She wasn't the kind to fly up like a pheasant over this and that. It took time before she committed herself. You couldn't tell from her face whether or not anything was working in her. For all he knew that night and Sunday, she didn't give a whoop about him but sided with the traitor. Monday morning after breakfast, she said, "Now I had enough waiting on George Roebuck till he's good and ready. Before you go to school, you can help me start shearin'." What could she mean by that? Resolve asked himself. It must have something in the wind, the way she talked. He drove the sheep, buying in the shed. She was there already, laying slabs on the wooden horses. She helped him lift Tibby, the oldest ewe, on the makeshift table. Then he held it quiet while she set to work on it. Those old black cutters in her hand went sure as death through all that heavy, ragged, dirty coat, finding the shape of the lean, hidden body underneath. Hardly never she fetched a pinch of blood to the blue skin. Tibby lay quiet enough. Like the old geese, she had been through this many times before. She would let the others do the hollering, and holler they did till you'd swear they were a bunch of humans a-bawling. When Sayward said she had enough, she and Resolve were wool all over, and the pile nigh about touched the roof of the shed. His mam looked at it. "You reckon that's enough for your last school day?" she asked him, and started to sort it over. Something went over Resolve so that he trembled. He just looked at her. His mam. He could always count on his mam. She never went back on him, and never would she. Didn't he tell himself she had something up her sleeve? "You have to lend a hand cardin' and weavin'," she said. "Time's short. Have to do it from the sheep's back to yourn. I heard of a woman once did it in 24 hours. Her 2 girls helped her. Her boy had to have a suit to go off to the Revolution. If they could do it in one night and day, I reckon I ought to could in a week. She was good as her word, too. That day yet she picked out a batch of wool stout enough to stand a boy's scuffling. Not the dag locks, feltings, or burmats. Those she cut out. They would do for coarse yarn, nor the finest wool either. That was for the backs of her littlest ones. No, she took just the strong, prime staples. Resolve helped with the grease for carding. To 3 pounds of wool they worked in a pound of melted fat, but the carding cumbered him. It took his man to sit there so easy, a toothed leather card in either hand, brushing and combing a lick of wool between, till she had it all trimmed one way, and with a catchy motion turned it into a roll of fleecy spinstuff that was ready for the wheel. The young ones gazed with respect at all those rolls of wool that were to be Resolve's suit of clothes. Resolve himself felt a swelling in his breast at the great size and lightness of the pile. Most every time he came in now, his ma'am was walking up and down in front of the big wheel with one of those rolls in one hand, a peg in the other, while the yarn twisted and quivered. The spokes flashed and hummed, and her feet patted mighty fast as she moved back and forward on the puncheon floor. She minded him of the ancient Greek woman his pap had made him learn by heart in that tongue, old Plathis, kind and brave by the gates of Eld, and how morning and evening, with her skilful hand, she spun, treading the long course back and forth before her wheel, going miles in a single day, and yet not a rod from its spokes, toiling all night and all the years, till she was withered and bent, and at 80 the gods said she could die, for she had spun enough. Only Resolve's ma'am wasn't withered and bent, and it would be a long time until she was 80, and yet in the latter part of the day, when the sun had waned and the candles were not yet lit, he could half close his eyes and think he saw her ancient and bowed with toil, like old Plethys, tottering up and down before her wheel, till he would cry in his heart that she should not die. Then it was sweet to open his eyes and see her still middle-aged and strong, with her hair that once she said was yaller, now brown with hardly a thread of gray. It was even good to hear her scold him for standing idle while so much remained to be done. Once the yarn was in hanks, he had to fetch water for her kettle. Gordon and Kinsey could have done this, for it took endless buckets to scour and rinse through many waters. But do you reckon they would lend a hand? No, it was for Resolve's suit. He could do it for hisself, though he had all the weaving to do as well. Soon as it was put through the dye kettle, his ma'am thought she'd wait to dye it till it was in cloth, but he begged so hard he'd help her pare all the inner oak bark she needed. He'd stay up the whole night, a-dipping those hanks if she'd let him. He wanted to weave stuff already dyed, and see the yarn grow into sky-blue cloth in front of his eyes. Oh, never had he loomed anything so careful before, keeping his yarn straight, hitting the beater even as could be, ever hard enough to make that cloth fit close against the weather, yet never too hard to mash it. Most times his little sisters crowded around the loom, feasting their eyes on the bright blue goods, wishing it was for them, each one a-yelling out she had asked for the trimmings first. His mammy stayed up most of the last night to stitch and hem the suit, finish the buttonholes, and sew on the horn buttons. Early by firelight next morning, proud as a young buck, with his spikes, resolved put it on and buttoned it up. For the first time, by 10 o'clock, he was sitting in that suit in the schoolhouse. So many folks came for the last day's doings. The scholars had to cram themselves on a bench against the front wall. One by one they got up, gave the master first attention, then obedience, and afterward set their toes to the big crack. Resolve never gave a sign he was his brother when Gourdon rose. Gourdon looked around wildly for escape, and seeing none, swallowed and began reading fast from his manuscript book. Master Wheeler, the subject I have to talk about is, which affords the greatest theme for eloquence, ancient or modern times. In my opinion, now is the best times to live in, but ancient times the best to be eloquent in. There is Rome, Carthage, Athens, all the great cities of the East. What were they in ancient times? Why, they were scenes of great victories. There was Caesar in Gaul. They were battles of great deeds, and acts of great valor. Alexander ruled the whole world in his time. They were scenes of great bloodshed. The greatest men among the ancients were Cicero, Caesar, and Alexander. There is Greece. She is one of the greatest countries of the East. Look at Rome. It was there that blood flowed through the streets, so it carried dead bodies and floated them along. But what are these places now? Why, they are no more than Tateville and Maytown. Hence, I conclude that ancient times afford a better theme for eloquences than modern times. Resolve felt shamed. He thought his pappy should have corrected Gourdon's paper. But no, he said, it's Gourdon's paper, not his teacher's. Let him give it as he wrote it. Resolve wanted to fix it up for Gourdon himself, but his ma'am put her foot down. No, she said, she liked it as it was. It was good for Gourdon. Oh, his ma'am was the great encourager. No matter how poor any of her young ones was at learning, she would say, now that was real good for him or her. It always perked them up, gave them sand to go on. But Resolve was bound he'd win back respect for the Wheelers today. When his pap called on him, he toed the crack, bowed to the master, and stood in his new blue homespun suit. Nobody knew what he had to say. He hadn't set it down on paper, but in his head while working in woods and barn, and there he had practiced its delivery. Master Wheeler, friends, and fellow scholars, the subject of my oration is the shame of slavery in a free state. According to the census, the state of Kentucky concedes 40,000 black slaves within its borders, South Carolina 140,000, and Virginia 300,000 poor and trembling colored vassals. Even the northern states that claim themselves superior to slavery, Pennsylvania, New York, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Jersey, contain some 50,000 human beings, owned body and soul by their masters. Also, the new territories of Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan admit their contribution to this blot on humanity. Now it is said that one of the few states of the Union not to blacken a white page of the slave census is our own beloved Ohio. We citizens pride ourselves that no serf or vassal has been held in Ohio since Colonel Bouquet freed the white captives from the Indian tribes before the Revolution. But is this like the third proposition of Euclid, true and demonstrable. No, and in the short space of this oration, I shall prove to your complete reason and satisfaction that the foul and despicable badge of servitude is still flaunted in our fair state, and that whatever name you call it by, it is still slavery. Consider this case of a black man, whom I shall not name, but a resident of Hamilton County, and supposed to be a free and unconstrained master of his own destiny. For several winters his labor has been to maul 100 rails a day for his white employer. One day the white man told him he had made a wager. That wager was that the black man could do not 100 but 200 rails a day. The black man was a man of pride and spirit, and the milk of human kindness. He wanted to win that wager for the white man. He got up before daylight and worked till dark, and mauled 210 rails, from sun-up to sundown, though it completely exhausted him. You would think the white man would be grateful, but now he abused the black man for doing only 100 rails a day, all this time, when he could have done 200. He told him from this on he had to do 150 rails a day for the wages he paid him, and 50 more every day to make up for the rails he owed him. And if this free and unconstrained black citizen of the Union refused, there was unaccountable commotion in the school. When Resolve looked up, he found Zephin Brown on his feet, looking like an angered Moses, his face white and terrible. "You may hold your tongue, boy, and keep your nose clean," he shouted. "Come with me, Alva. We didn't come here to be insulted by the schoolmaster and his son." Then, with righteous dignity, he led his wife and boy from the school. Now nobody was more surprised than Resolve to see them rise and go. He was beat out, utterly bamboozled. He thought nobody would know who he was talking about. He reckoned folks would think his black man lived in Hamilton County, like he said, and not here. Why, he never even mentioned the name of Zephin Brown, or gave a hint that Caesar was the name of the black man. But if Zephin Brown knew, likely so did the others. Resolve felt a little fright and shame at what he had done. He had got his pappy in a peck of trouble. This is what he got, he told himself, for reckoning he could make a better speech than his brother. He looked mighty anxious at his pappy, but his pappy wouldn't look at him. Folks didn't know whether or not to clap Resolve when he sat down. They were watching his teacher, and his teacher gave no sign till the last scholar was done, and now it was time for the master to talk to the school. He stood there, a noble figure, in his white stand-up collar that had room for his chin between the spreading points, his tie folded like a black scarf on his upper breast. He looked like a chief justice, and he talked of faraway places, of the golden sands, of Pactolus, and of the Pelian spear that Achilles cut from an ash on the magic mount. O Resolve would sell his soul could he but have a golden tongue like his father, especially now when he came near the end and was taking farewell of his academy. The school was still as death. You might have thought that these were the last sad words of Socrates, that this stretch of faces was the Aegean Sea, that the narrow place between two plank desks was the Straits of Gatz, and that Colonel Sudham's bald head back there was a landmark across Italy, the dome of St. Peter's rising through the golden light of the eternal city. And now I wish to say, Porteous announced, that my eldest son shall not return to the academy. There was bottomless silence for a moment in the school and in the eldest son's heart. Then Porteous added, "He will read law with me at home and in my Tateville office." Resolve sat stiff as a poking stick when he heard it. Suddenly, in his mind, he could see the dying man, Jude McWhirter, sitting up in bed, and could hear him say again, "The blessings of the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob rest upon you, my children, and my godson." That blessing was coming true. Out here in the school he saw his sisters, Huldah and Libby, peering at him and whispering together. But his eyes went to his ma'am. Did she hear that? His look said, did she know what that meant? That was his pappy's way of saying, amen to what he did. He was telling out loud in front of everybody that he stood by him, that like father, like son. His ma'am's eyes looked back at him, warm, but her face stayed calm as could be. That was his ma'am all over. You never could tell what thoughts she had behind that broad, steady, sweet-smelling face of hers. This is what Sayward was thinking, so that up there was the woman Porteous meant to bring down from Tateville. Why, she was a good deal younger than anybody expected. Her hair was yaller as Sayward's had been, as a girl, but never had Sayward such a quilted blue bonnet with a black velvet edge and strings. It was curious none had made them acquainted before. School-wrapped. Sayward had to go up and make herself known. Just for a shake they had stood there and looked at each other. So this, Sayward had said to herself, is Porteous's new schoolmistress, who knew all her letters and sums besides, who could teach girls turkey work, the Queen's stitch, and how to knit the alphabet or a verse from the Bible into a pair of mittens. Her slight form was pranked out in striped black goods, so tight-fitting and stylish it could only have been sewed up by a city seamstress. She had velvet piped mitts, and in her hand she carried a fine bag of colored beads shaped like a stocking, the like of which Sayward had never seen before. Oh, she was very straightly attired, erect and circumspect, all except the curl on her forehead, just a small curled lock, pasted against her pale skin, but it minded Sayward of a question mark, turned upside down.